Most people think retirement is a finish line, a number on a calendar, 55 or 65. Pick a date, stop working, start relaxing. But what almost nobody tells you is that one small decision can quietly cost you tens of thousands of dollars in taxes, or save you just as much. Not because you earned more, not because you invested better, but because you chose the wrong age. If you've ever wondered whether retiring at 55 or waiting until 65 actually makes a difference financially, especially when it comes to taxes, you're asking the right question. Because retirement isn't just about how much money you have, it's about how much of it you get to keep. I've read countless stories from people who retired early and felt proud of escaping the workforce, only to realize years later that the tax system slowly took more than they expected. I've also seen people who waited, thinking they were doing the responsible thing, and still ended up paying unnecessary taxes simply because they didn't understand how timing works. This isn't about fear, and it's not about telling you to work longer than you want to. It's about clarity. Because the truth is, the tax system treats a 55-year-old retiree and a 65-year-old retiree very differently, and those differences compound quietly year after year. Let's start with the biggest misunderstanding. Many people assume that if they stop working earlier, they'll pay less tax because they're earning less. On the surface, that sounds logical. No paycheck, no tax problem. But retirement income doesn't come from one place. It comes from many small streams, and each one is taxed differently depending on your age. At 55, most retirees rely heavily on savings, early withdrawals, and sometimes part-time income. At 65, income tends to shift toward pensions, government benefits, and tax-advantaged withdrawals. That shift alone can change your entire tax picture. One man shared his story online about retiring at 55 after a long corporate career. He had done everything right, saved aggressively, maxed out retirement accounts, paid off his spouse. He thought he had beaten the system. But what he didn't realize was that accessing his money early pushed him into higher effective tax rates than he ever expected. Not because he was rich, but because the rules weren't designed for early retirees. When you retire at 55, you're in a strange middle zone. You're no longer working, but you're also not yet considered a traditional retiree by the tax system. Certain tax breaks, credits, and thresholds simply don't apply to you yet. That means withdrawals that seem harmless on paper can quietly stack up and push you into higher taxable income brackets. Many early retirees are forced to draw from accounts that were designed to be touched later. Even when penalties are avoided through specific rules or exceptions, the tax treatment can still be unfavorable. Withdrawals are often treated as ordinary income, and without careful planning, they can create a tax bill that feels completely out of proportion to your lifestyle. Compare that to someone who retires at 65. At that age, the system finally starts working with you instead of against you. Income sources change, tax thresholds widen, certain benefits become available that simply don't exist at 55. And perhaps most importantly, you gain more control over how and when your income is recognized for tax purposes. That control is everything. A woman once explained how she waited until 65 to retire, even though she could have stopped working earlier. Not because she loved her job, but because she wanted flexibility. When she finally retired, she was able to spread her income more evenly, use tax-advantaged withdrawals strategically, and avoid large spikes in taxable income. The result wasn't dramatic in one single year. It was dramatic over 10. This is where many people get confused. They look at one tax year and make a decision based on that snapshot. But retirement taxes are not a one-year problem. They're a long-term pattern. What matters isn't just how much tax you pay this year, but how consistently you can keep your income in lower tax brackets year after year. Retiring at 55 often means 10 extra years of self-funding before traditional retirement benefits fully kick in. That sounds empowering, but it also means 10 years of making tax decisions without the safety net of age-based advantages.
If those years aren't planned carefully, they can become some of the most expensive years of your retirement. On the other hand, waiting until 65 compresses that timeline. You move more quickly into a phase where the tax system recognizes you as a retiree. That recognition matters more than most people realize. Another overlooked factor is how retirement timing affects your taxable income mix. Taxes are not just about how much money you receive, but what kind of money it is. Some income is taxed aggressively, some are taxed lightly, some aren't taxed at all. The balance between those types changes dramatically depending on when you retire. At 55, many people rely on fully taxable sources first, simply because that's what's available. At 65, retirees often have more flexibility to blend taxable, partially taxable, and tax-free income in a way that keeps their overall tax bill lower.
At 55, many people rely on fully taxable sources first, simply because that's what's available. At 65, retirees often have more flexibility to blend taxable, partially taxable, and tax-free income in a way that keeps their overall tax bill lower. One retiree described it perfectly. He said retiring early felt like driving without brakes. Every financial decision had immediate consequences. Retiring later felt like driving with cruise control. He wasn't going faster, but everything was smoother and more predictable. That predictability is what allows better tax planning. There's also the psychological side of taxes in retirement. Early retirees often feel pressure to make the money last, which can lead to large withdrawals during market downturns or unexpected expenses. Those withdrawals don't just affect your portfolio, they affect your taxes. A single bad year can undo years of careful planning. Waiting until 65 doesn't eliminate risk, but it reduces the number of years you're exposed to that pressure. Fewer years of forced withdrawals often mean fewer tax surprises. Now, this doesn't mean retiring at 55 is a mistake. For some people, it's the right choice, emotionally, physically, and even financially. But it does mean that retiring at 55 without understanding the tax implications is one of the most common and costly errors people make. What most people really want isn't to retire early or late. They want freedom. They want to know that the money they worked for isn't being slowly drained by taxes they didn't anticipate. That's why this comparison matters. Because the difference between 55 and 65 isn't just 10 years of work, it's 10 years of tax treatment, 10 years of income structure, and 10 years of compounding decisions. When people retire at 55, the first surprise isn't usually boredom or a lack of purpose. It's the realization that their money doesn't behave the way they expected it to. Not because they miscalculated how much they saved, but because they misunderstood how retirement income is taxed in those early years. At 55, you are officially retired in your own mind, but not in the eyes of the tax system. And that distinction matters more than most people ever anticipate. During these early retirement years, income often comes from accounts that were designed to be touched later in life. Even when you're allowed to access them without penalties, the tax treatment is often the same as earned income. That means every dollar withdrawn stacks on top of the next, slowly pushing your taxable income higher than you planned. Many early retirees assume they'll be in a low tax bracket because they're living modestly. But modest living doesn't always translate to modest taxable income. Withdrawals used to pay off debts, help family members, or handle medical costs can easily turn a quiet year into a surprisingly expensive one from a tax perspective. One early retiree shared how he planned to withdraw a fixed amount every year to keep things simple. What he didn't realize was that simplicity came at a cost. Each withdrawal was taxed the same way year after year without the ability to offset it with age-based credits or exclusions. By the time he reached his early 60s, he had paid far more in cumulative taxes than he ever expected, even though his lifestyle never changed.
Another common issue at 55 is timing. When you're no longer working, you lose the natural structure that a paycheck provides. Income becomes something you actively manage rather than passively receive. Without a clear strategy, it's easy to take too much in one year and too little in another, creating tax spikes that could have been avoided. These spikes are dangerous because taxes are progressive. A single year of higher withdrawals doesn't just increase your tax bill slightly. It can push part of your income into a much higher bracket, meaning that extra money is taxed at a significantly higher rate. And once that money is taxed, there's no getting it back. Waiting until 65 changes this dynamic in subtle but powerful ways. By that point, income streams tend to be more structured. Pensions, government benefits, and retirement distributions often arrive on predictable schedules. That predictability allows for smoother income planning and fewer sudden tax surprises. More importantly, the tax system itself becomes more forgiving. Thresholds change. Certain credits and exemptions become available. An income that would have been heavily taxed at 55 may be treated more favorably at 65. A woman once explained that retiring at 65 gave her something she never expected: peace of mind around taxes. She wasn't earning more than her friends who retired earlier, but she was paying less simply because her income sources were aligned with her age. The same amount of money, structured differently, led to a completely different outcome. Another overlooked factor is how early retirement affects your future tax years. Taxes aren't isolated events. What you do at 55 affects what happens at 60, 65, and beyond. Large withdrawals early on can shrink accounts that might have grown more efficiently if left untouched for a few more years. This creates a ripple effect. Smaller balances later mean less flexibility. Less flexibility means fewer options to manage taxable income, and fewer options almost always lead to higher lifetime taxes. People who wait until 65 often benefit from additional years of growth, even if they aren't contributing much anymore. Growth itself isn't taxed until it's realized, which means delaying withdrawals can quietly reduce lifetime tax exposure. One retiree described it as buying time from the tax system. Every year he waited was another year his money grew without being taxed, and another year closer to a phase where withdrawals would be treated more gently. There's also the issue of health and unexpected expenses. Early retirees are more likely to face large, unplanned costs during years when their tax position is less favorable. A medical expense or family emergency at 57 can force withdrawals that create a tax problem on top of an already stressful situation. At 65, those same expenses often occur during a period when income can be adjusted more strategically. That doesn't eliminate stress, but it does reduce the chance of compounding financial damage. Another quiet disadvantage of retiring at 55 is the lack of built-in buffers. At 65, many retirees have access to income sources that don't require active decision-making. That stability acts as a buffer against poor timing or emotional decisions. At 55, you are the buffer. Every decision rests on your shoulders, and mistakes are easier to make. This is why so many early retirees describe their first decade as mentally exhausting, not because they regret retiring, but because managing income and taxes becomes a constant background concern. The freedom they imagined often comes with an invisible workload they didn't anticipate. Waiting until 65 doesn't remove responsibility, but it redistributes it. Some decisions are made for you, and that can actually be an advantage.
It's also important to talk about how early retirement affects future required withdrawals. Large withdrawals at 55 reduce balances that might otherwise be spread over a longer period. That compression can lead to higher taxable income later, even if spending stays the same. People are often shocked to discover that their taxes go up later in retirement, not down. This usually traces back to decisions made in the first few years after retiring. Those early choices set the trajectory. Someone who retires at 65 often enters retirement with a clearer picture of their long-term income needs and tax exposure. They're closer to the phase where lifetime planning becomes more precise. Someone who retires at 55 is still guessing, still adjusting, and often still learning how the system actually works. None of this means that retiring later is automatically better, but it does mean that retiring earlier requires a level of tax awareness that most people don't have when they make the decision. The biggest mistake isn't retiring at 55. The biggest mistake is assuming the tax system will adjust itself to your lifestyle. It won't. Taxes reward timing, structure, and patience. They punish haste, uneven income, and assumptions. By the time someone reaches 65, retirement no longer feels theoretical. It feels earned. Years of work are behind you, and the focus naturally shifts from accumulation to preservation. But what often surprises people is that this stage isn't just calmer emotionally, it's also calmer financially, especially when it comes to taxes. At 65, the tax system finally begins to recognize you as someone it was designed to accommodate. The rules soften, the pressure eases, and income becomes easier to manage without triggering unintended consequences. One of the most important differences at 65 is the variety of income sources available. Instead of relying heavily on a single type of withdrawal, many retirees at this age can blend different streams in a way that smooths out taxable income. This blending is what keeps taxes low over time. People who retire at 65 often describe their finances as more predictable. That predictability isn't just comforting, it's powerful. When you can anticipate your income, you can plan withdrawals carefully, avoid spikes, and keep yourself in lower tax ranges year after year. A retiree once shared how she expected to pay more in taxes after retiring later because she had earned more over her lifetime. Instead, she found the opposite. Her tax bills became smaller and more stable. Nothing dramatic changed in her lifestyle. What changed was how her income was categorized and timed. A key advantage is the ability to delay certain withdrawals. Even after retirement, many people don't need to touch all their accounts immediately. This creates room to maneuver. You can decide which accounts to draw from first and which to let grow longer, giving you more control over when income becomes taxable. At 55, that flexibility is often missing. Early retirees usually need money right away, and that urgency limits choice. At 65, the urgency is lower. Choice expands. This expansion of choice is one of the most overlooked benefits of waiting. Taxes are rarely reduced by earning less. They're reduced by choosing wisely. And wise choices require options.
Another subtle shift at 65 is mindset. People who retire later tend to think in longer arcs. They're less focused on immediate freedom and more focused on sustainability. That perspective naturally leads to better tax decisions. A man who retired at 65 explained that he stopped thinking in years and started thinking in decades. Instead of asking, "How much can I take this year?" he asked, "How do I want my income to look for the next 20 years?" That shift alone helped him avoid costly tax mistakes. There's also less pressure to prove anything. Early retirees sometimes feel the need to justify their decision by enjoying life aggressively, traveling more, spending more, withdrawing more. Later retirees tend to move at a slower, more intentional pace. That moderation often keeps taxable income lower without feeling restrictive. Health also plays a role here. At 65, many people begin factoring health care and longevity more seriously into their plans. This leads to more conservative income strategies, which, again, reduces the risk of tax spikes. Another key difference is how retirees at 65 handle unexpected expenses. Instead of pulling a large lump sum from one account, they're more likely to spread costs across time or sources. This approach keeps taxable income from jumping in any single year. One woman described how a major home repair could have caused a significant tax bill if she had retired earlier. By the time it happened at 67, she was able to handle it without disrupting her overall tax strategy.
Same expense, very different outcome. Retiring at 65 also means fewer years where you are solely responsible for generating your own income. That matters more than it sounds. Every year you self-fund without structured income increases, the risk of mistakes. Fewer self-funded years usually mean fewer tax errors. This doesn't mean retirees at 65 don't make mistakes, they do. But the margin for error is larger. The system is more forgiving. Another important point is how waiting affects lifetime taxes, not just annual taxes. Many people fixate on whether working longer means paying more tax while working. What they miss is how much tax they avoid later by entering retirement in a stronger position. Working longer may increase taxes during those final working years, but it often reduces taxes across the rest of retirement. When you look at the full picture, waiting can mean paying less overall, even if you paid more at the end of your career. A retiree once put it simply. He said, "I paid a bit more while I was working, but I paid far less when I stopped." Over time, that trade-off worked in his favor. This is why the question isn't really about 55 versus 65. It's about whether you want to manage taxes in the most complex phase of your life, or in the phase where the system finally aligns with your needs. Retiring at 65 doesn't guarantee lower taxes, but it makes lower taxes easier to achieve. The real advantage lies in alignment. Your age, your income sources, and the tax rules finally point in the same direction. When you step back and look at retirement as a whole, the question stops being about age and starts being about timing. Not calendar timing, but financial timing. When income begins, when withdrawals happen, when taxes are triggered, and how long each decision echoes into the future. Retiring at 55 and retiring at 65 are not simply two versions of the same life with 10 years added or removed. They create two completely different tax paths. One is longer, more exposed, and more sensitive to mistakes. The other is shorter, more structured, and more forgiving. People who retire at 55 often do so with confidence. They've run the numbers, they've built the savings, they've earned their freedom. But many of them underestimate how long 10 years really is when you're funding everything yourself. 10 years of decisions, 10 years of withdrawals, 10 years where one poorly timed move can quietly increase lifetime taxes far beyond what they expected. Over time, those extra taxes don't show up as a single painful bill. They show up as a slow leak. A little more is taken each year, a little less flexibility later, a little more stress when unexpected expenses appear. Those who wait until 65 usually don't feel that same pressure. Their retirement timeline is tighter. Their income sources arrive closer together, and the tax system treats their money differently from the start. This is why many people who retire later end up paying less in lifetime taxes, even though they worked longer. It isn't because they were smarter or luckier, it's because their income aligned better with the rules. One of the most telling patterns comes from people who retired at 55 and later said they wish they had waited just a few more years, not because they missed work, not because they needed more money, but because those extra years would have simplified everything. Fewer decisions, fewer tax surprises, fewer regrets. That doesn't mean waiting until 65 is always the right answer. For some, retiring at 55 is worth every extra dollar paid in taxes. Health, family, and personal fulfillment matter more than numbers on a spreadsheet. But the people who thrive after retiring early almost always have one thing in common. They planned for taxes as carefully as they planned for savings. They understood that the cost of early freedom isn't just lower income, it's higher complexity. If you're considering retiring at 55, the real question isn't whether you can afford it. It's whether you're prepared to manage your income strategically for a full decade before the system starts helping you. If you're considering waiting until 65, the question isn't whether you're giving up freedom. It's whether those extra years buy you simplicity, predictability, and lower lifetime taxes. The biggest mistake people make is framing this decision emotionally. They ask, "Do I want to keep working?" when the better question is, "When will my money work best for me?"
Taxes don't care how tired you are. They care about timing. They care about structure. They care about consistency. A smooth retirement is rarely about maximizing one year. It's about minimizing friction over many years. Whether you choose 55 or 65, the goal is the same. Keep your income steady. Avoid spikes, give yourself options, and understand that the earlier you retire, the more responsibility you take on yourself. There is no perfect retirement age, but there is a better aligned one for each person. The people who save the most in taxes aren't the ones who retire the earliest or the latest. They're the ones who retire when their income, their lifestyle, and the tax system finally move in the same direction. That alignment is what turns retirement from a financial struggle into a quiet, confident chapter of life. And in the end, that's what most people are really looking for. Not just more years off work, but more years with less stress, fewer surprises, and the peace of knowing that the money they worked so hard for is truly working for them. Thank you for staying with me through this discussion. If this helped you see retirement timing in a clearer way, consider sharing your thoughts below. And if you want more honest conversations about retirement, money, and long-term security, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next.